The lab was quiet, too quiet for a case that had refused to speak for weeks. A technician leaned over a sealed evidence bag, carefully reopening something that had already been logged, labeled, and almost forgotten. A small stain, barely noticeable the first time. But now, under stronger analysis, it wasn't just a stain anymore. It was a question. Because if this trace had been what it now appeared to be, then everything about this case had been wrong from the start, and someone out there had been walking free because of it. Before we go deeper into this case, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? And what's the weather like today? Drop it in the comments. I read more of them than you think. Now let's get into what really happened here. Nancy Guthrie lived a life built on routine. At 84 years old, her days followed a rhythm that rarely changed. Morning light through the same window, coffee prepared the same way, doors locked at the same time each evening. People who knew her described her as careful, not fearful, just aware. She didn't take unnecessary risks. She didn't invite uncertainty into her life. And that's what makes what happened next so difficult to understand. Nancy lived in Tucson, Arizona, a city known for its wide skies, dry air, and quiet residential neighborhoods that often feel untouched by chaos. Her home sat in one of those neighborhoods. Not isolated, but not crowded either. The kind of place where people notice unfamiliar cars. The kind of place where routine stands out. And Nancy was routine. She wasn't someone who would suddenly disappear without explanation. She had structure, predictability, stability. But she also had something else, a connection. Nancy was the mother of a nationally recognized media personality, someone whose face and voice were known across the country. And while Nancy herself stayed out of the spotlight, that connection mattered. Because in cases like this, connections create attention, and attention changes everything. February 1st, 2026 started like any other day. There were no signs that anything unusual was about to happen, no reports of disturbance, no unusual activity noticed by neighbors, no early warning signs that something was about to break. The pattern Nancy had followed for years. That's what makes the timeline so unsettling. Because when investigators later tried to piece together the sequence of events, they ran into a problem. There was a gap, a moment where everything simply stopped making sense. Nancy had last been seen inside her home. There were no confirmed sightings of her leaving, no clear indication that she had stepped outside voluntarily. And yet, she wasn't there anymore. Inside the house, things appeared normal. Nothing overturned, nothing broken. But something was off. Subtle details that didn't immediately stand out began to feel out of place when viewed together. And that's when the case began to shift. Because a disappearance without disturbance isn't normal. It's controlled. In modern investigations, cameras don't just record events. They reveal behavior. And in this case, one camera would become impossible to ignore. The doorbell camera. At first, it seemed like routine footage. Empty frames, stillness, nothing out of the ordinary. Until one segment changed everything. An individual appeared near the camera, not walking past, not approaching the door in a typical way, but lingering. There was a pause in their movement, a hesitation that didn't match normal behavior. Then something else. They interacted with the camera, not accidentally, deliberately, a movement that suggested awareness of being recorded, possibly even testing it. That moment introduced something critical into the case. Because people who don't belong in a space don't usually pause to study surveillance. But someone planning something would. When authorities first arrived, they were dealing with uncertainty. No clear evidence of a break-in, no immediate signs of violence. And that led to a dangerous assumption, that this might not be a crime scene in the traditional sense. Early classifications in cases like this matter more than people realize, because they shape how evidence is prioritized, what gets tested immediately, what gets set aside. And in Nancy's case, something small was set aside. During the initial forensic sweep, investigators identified a trace, a small amount of what appeared to be blood. Not dramatic, not obvious, and not, at the time, clearly connected to a violent event. So it was documented, logged, and deprioritized. That decision would later become one of the most critical turning points in the entire case. At this point, investigators were facing a puzzle with missing pieces. A person gone without explanation, a possible unknown individual near the home, and a scene that didn't tell a clear story. Cases like this create pressure, not just from within law enforcement, but from the outside. Media attention began to build. Public interest grew. And with it came questions. How does someone disappear from inside their own home without leaving a trace? The more people asked that question, the more it became clear that something had been missed. I want to pause here for a second. Based on everything you've heard so far, do you think this was planned? Or do you think something unexpected happened inside that house? Let me know what you think, because what comes next might change your answer. As the case gained attention, federal involvement became inevitable. The FBI joined the effort, bringing with them resources that local teams often don't have access to. Advanced forensic analysis, behavioral profiling, data reconstruction, and perhaps most importantly, experience with cases that don't follow normal patterns. Because that's what this had become. Not just a disappearance, but a situation where the absence of evidence was starting to look intentional. When federal analysts reviewed the case, they approached it differently. Instead of asking what was there, they focused on what wasn't. No forced entry, no signs of struggle, no immediate witnesses. That combination doesn't suggest randomness. It suggests control. And control suggests planning, which brings the investigation back to that moment on camera. The individual who paused, observed, interacted, because that behavior now looked less like curiosity and more like preparation. With fresh eyes on the case, investigators began revisiting everything, including the detail that had once seemed too small to matter, that trace of blood. Using more advanced techniques, analysts took another look. And this time, they weren't asking if it was significant. They were asking what it meant. Because if that trace was connected to Nancy, then the entire narrative of the case would change. New analysis doesn't just reveal information. It challenges assumptions. And in this case, it raised a serious possibility. That the scene wasn't as clean as it first appeared. That something had happened inside that home. That hadn't been fully understood. And if that was true, then someone had either made a mistake or counted on that detail being overlooked. If you're into real cases like this, the ones that don't make sense at first, make sure you subscribe to Crime Cortex, because the deeper we go, the more these stories start to reveal. At this point in the case, everything begins to shift. A small piece of evidence, a moment on camera, a decision made early. That may have allowed someone to walk away unnoticed. But now, that same detail might be the one thing that brings everything back. Because in cases like this, it's not always the obvious clues that matter. It's the ones that were almost ignored. When evidence is reviewed a second time, it's never routine. It means something didn't sit right the first time. And in this case, that something was small enough to overlook, but significant enough to change everything. The sample originally logged as minor was reprocessed using updated forensic techniques, more sensitive analysis, more precise DNA extraction methods, and a different question guiding the process. Not, is this relevant, but what does this reveal? Because sometimes relevance isn't obvious until you look closer. The results didn't scream for attention. They didn't immediately point to a name or a face, but they did something more important. They contradicted the original assumption. This wasn't random contamination. This wasn't unrelated. This was connected. And that meant one thing. Nancy hadn't simply disappeared. Something had happened inside that house. Once that possibility entered the investigation, everything had to be reconsidered. Every step, every movement, every assumption. Investigators began reconstructing the interior of the home not physically, but behaviorally. Where would someone stand? How would they move? What would they avoid touching? And, most importantly, how would they leave without creating visible chaos? Because the absence of disruption wasn't natural. It was deliberate. This wasn't a rushed act. It wasn't driven by panic. It suggested control from beginning to end. And that level of control narrows the field. Not everyone can carry out something like that. The trace evidence combined with the camera footage began forming a pattern. Not a full picture yet, but enough to ask better questions. The individual near the camera wasn't just passing through. They were aware of surveillance, which means they understood risk. And someone who understands risk doesn't act without preparation. That leads to a possibility investigators couldn't ignore. This person had either done something like this before or had spent time thinking about how to do it. In criminal behavior, there's a difference between opportunity and control. Opportunity is impulsive. It happens when circumstances align. Control is different. Control is planned, measured, executed with intention, and everything in this case pointed toward control. The timing, the lack of visible struggle, the minimal trace left behind. Even the interaction with the camera. These weren't random elements. They were decisions, and decisions leave patterns. The first major theory builds from that idea. Nancy wasn't chosen by chance. She was selected, not necessarily because of who she was as an individual, but because of what she represented, her connection, her environment, her predictability. A person living a structured life becomes easier to study, easier to anticipate, easier to approach at the exact moment they are most vulnerable. If this was targeted, then the suspect didn't just act. They prepared, they observed, and they waited. The second theory focuses on surveillance. That moment at the camera wasn't the beginning. It was the moment they were seen, which raises a question that changes everything. How many times had they been there before? Surveillance doesn't always involve technology. Sometimes it's as simple as watching from a distance, learning patterns, identifying routines. Nancy's life made that easier. Same schedule, same environment, few unexpected changes. If someone had been observing her over time, they wouldn't need to rush. They would simply wait for the right moment. And when that moment came, everything would appear seamless. The third theory is the one investigators approach carefully, because it changes the nature of the case entirely. Familiarity. Not necessarily someone close, but someone who understood the space, the layout, the timing, the behavior inside the home. Because gaining access without disruption often requires more than planning. It requires knowledge, and knowledge comes from exposure. This doesn't mean the suspect was known to Nancy, but it does raise the possibility that they weren't a complete stranger to the environment. Now, pause for a second. Think about this. If someone planned this, if they understood the environment, if they controlled every step, then one question becomes impossible to ignore. What went wrong? Because something did. That trace of evidence, that small detail, it wasn't supposed to be there. No plan is perfect. Even the most controlled actions leave something behind. A misstep, a moment of miscalculation, a detail that doesn't fit. And in many cases, that's all it takes. The trace of blood may have come from a brief interaction, something that wasn't part of the plan, something that couldn't be fully controlled. And that's where cases turn, not because of what was done right, but because of what went slightly wrong. Based on behavior, analysts begin building a profile, not a name, not an identity, but a pattern of traits. This individual likely understands risk, plans ahead, avoids unnecessary exposure, maintains control under pressure. They don't act impulsively, they don't leave obvious trails, and they don't rely on luck. But there's something else. They made at least one mistake, and that mistake may now be enough. Control-driven individuals operate differently. They don't just want an outcome, they want precision. Every movement calculated, every variable considered. And when something disrupts that control, it creates pressure, because maintaining control doesn't end when the act is done. It continues afterward, in behavior, in decisions, in avoidance, which means if the suspect believes they were careful, they may not realize what they left behind. With new analysis in place, the investigation shifts again, not publicly, but internally. Focus narrows, possibilities reduce, and patterns become clearer. Investigators begin looking for alignment, people who match behavior, movement patterns, access possibilities, because once you move from randomness to control, the field becomes smaller. Cases like this don't resolve instantly. They build, piece by piece, until one detail connects everything. And right now, the case is sitting at that point, where the evidence doesn't yet speak fully, but it's starting to form a voice. Let me ask you something. Do you think the person responsible knows they made a mistake, or do you think they still believe they got away with it? Drop your answer below, because what happens next depends on that. Time changes investigations, evidence ages, memories shift, but it also does something else. It creates opportunity, because the longer someone believes they are safe, the more likely they are to relax, to slip, to make another mistake. And investigators know that, which is why they don't always rush. Sometimes they wait. Right now the case stands at a critical point, not solved, but no longer silent. A trace that was once ignored is now being taken seriously. A moment on camera now carries more meaning than ever before. And somewhere out there, there is a person who believed this would never come back to them. But if the evidence continues to lead where it's starting to point, that belief won't last, because the smallest detail is often the one that changes everything. There's a moment in every unresolved case when it stops being about what happened and starts becoming about what was missed. That's where this case is now. For weeks, the focus was outward, searching, scanning, expanding. But now, everything is turning inward. Back to the house, back to the timeline, back to the smallest details that didn't seem important at the time. Because those details are starting to connect. The timeline hasn't changed, but the way it's understood has. Nancy was inside her home. No confirmed exit. No verified movement beyond a certain point. That alone is enough to narrow possibilities. But now, with the updated analysis, that timeline feels tighter, more controlled, more deliberate. Because if something happened inside, then the window of action becomes very specific, very narrow, and very telling. Investigators don't announce turning points right away. They observe them first, test them, confirm them quietly. But internally, there's often a moment where everything starts to align. This case may be approaching that moment, not because of one major breakthrough, but because multiple small details are now pointing in the same direction. And when that happens, The case stops being wide open. It starts to focus. At this stage, the investigation may not have a public suspect, but that doesn't mean there isn't one. Profiles become sharper. Possibilities become fewer. Patterns begin to match. And while the public sees uncertainty, behind the scenes, clarity begins to form. Because once behavior is understood, it becomes easier to recognize. Think about what this means for a second. If the suspect planned everything, if they controlled the environment, if they believed they left nothing behind, then that one small detail, that trace, becomes everything, because it breaks the illusion of perfection. It introduces doubt. And once doubt enters a case, it spreads into every assumption, every timeline, every movement. Not every case is solved with a dramatic discovery. Sometimes it's slower than that, more methodical. A detail leads to a pattern leads to a person leads to confirmation, and confirmation changes everything. Right now, this case sits at the beginning of that process. Amid all the analysis, it's easy to forget what this case really is. Not just evidence, not just timelines, but a person. Nancy Guthrie, a life built over decades, a routine that reflected stability, a presence that mattered to people around her. And now, an absence that hasn't been explained. That's what drives cases like this forward. Not just the need to solve a puzzle, but the need to answer a question that should never exist. From the outside, it may seem like nothing is happening. No major updates, no confirmed suspect, no resolution, but silence in a case like this doesn't mean inactivity. It often means the opposite. Work is being done, quietly, carefully, because when a case reaches this stage, precision matters more than speed. There's something else to consider. If the suspect believes the case is quiet, they may believe it's over. That belief creates comfort, and comfort creates risk, because people who feel safe stop being careful. They return to patterns, they repeat behaviors, and that's when they become visible again. I want you to think about everything we've covered. The timeline, the footage, the evidence, the theories. Now ask yourself this: which part of this case feels the most important to you? The camera moment, the trace evidence, or the idea that this was planned from the beginning? Let me know in the comments, because sometimes the audience sees things differently. Everything in this case comes back to one idea: control. Someone controlled the situation, controlled the environment, controlled the outcome. But control is never perfect, and perfection is what they were counting on. That's where the mistake matters, because it breaks that control. It introduces something unpredictable, and unpredictability is what solves cases like this. Right now, this case stands at the edge. Not fully solved, but no longer unclear. The evidence is speaking, even if it's doing so quietly, and investigators are listening, piece by piece, step by step, closing in. If you've made it this far, you already know this isn't just another story. This is a case that's still unfolding. So if you want to stay updated on developments like this, make sure you subscribe to Crime Cortex, because when new details come out, you'll want to see how everything connects. Somewhere out there is a person who believed this would never come back to them, who believed the plan was clean, the execution controlled, the outcome final. But one detail, one small, almost ignored detail, may have changed everything. Because in cases like this, it's never the loudest clue that solves it. It's the quiet one, the one that was almost missed. And now, it's the one that might expose the truth. Thank you for watching Crime Cortex.